Welcome to the Therapist Thrival Guide. My name is Miranda Barker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Lucas Vellini.
Hi, Miranda.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
You were not here for last week's episode, so I'm glad that you're back.
Which is weird because I was here yesterday.
That's true. We're doing some batch recordings, and so
cool. Got it.
we have to keep the illusion alive, that sort of thing. This month is September. It's Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And as a mental health company, we are really trying to dive into some of the stigma behind suicide, wanting to talk more about suicide, educate our clinicians, as well as, share some of the stories of the clinicians and the people that we work with who have been affected by suicide loss. And so in this episode, we are talking specifically about kind of the complicated grief that comes with a suicide loss. And so anytime we talk about grief, we have to bring on Erin Opoku.
She's back.
She's back. And then I finally convinced Jennifer Keehn to join as well, because she also specializes in this important topic. And so do you two want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your role here at Ellie, and then kind of what interests you in this topic?
Love it. My name is Erin Opoku. I've been with Ellie for 6 years. Current title is Clinical Operations Director. I am a LMFT at heart and licensed marriage and family therapist, and have been practicing it with grief and loss since the moment I kind of started. That was what has gotten me into this work. And so I have a lot of personal and professional experience.
Awesome. Jennifer?
Yep, I'm Jennifer Keehn, licensed professional clinical counselor. I've been with Ellie Mental Health for about 2 years now. Current title is Clinical Operations Director for 3 locations here in Minnesota. I specialize in grief and loss, as you mentioned, as well as military families, similar to Erin, a lot of personal and professional experience.
Awesome.
Married to a military man.
I am, yes.
Who also works at Ellie.
Yes, he does. 16 years.
I'm
recently
a big fan
retired.
of him.
Oh, good.
It's
Me too.
so funny to me that you both say current title because you both have had so many hats here at Ellie in leadership positions as therapists. Do you both still see clients?
Yeah, we do. My caseload has really reduced, but I have been able to stay immersed into that grief and loss world before I love.
Yeah, before we jump into that topic, out of curiosity, I'm interested to know, what you two think about having therapists in leadership, and what you like about kind of the model that Ellie is reintroducing or growing into.
Sure. I mean, I think it's essential to have a therapist in leadership because we know what it's like to be a therapist. And so we can advocate for our clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think necessary, actually. I think in this profession and within a company that holds all of the therapists that we do, having that perspective, unique perspective, because we know what it looks like behind those closed doors, 25 hours, a week for therapists that are doing that hard work full time.
Do you like the mix of kind of clients and leadership that you're in?
Love it.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't have it any other way.
Really? There's
Yeah.
not a part of you that's sad that you don't see clients full time anymore?
I
interesting.
love the client work and the diversity that comes with supporting other clinicians in doing the work is why I continue to kind of seek leadership routes.
That's awesome. Okay, we can end this sidebar. I was just curious, since you both are in, it's pretty rare that we have people on the podcast that are in leadership roles as well as just kind of seeing clients at the same time. And so I was just curious what your thoughts were. But all right, let's jump into grief and loss. Let's jump into talking more about this, the complications of losing someone to suicide. Where do you guys want to start?
I don't know, maybe addressing the fact that it's probably one of the most complicated, painful experiences anybody could ever go through.
Having a loved one die by suicide?
Yeah. Yeah. It's heavy.
I think a lot of losses are heavy. I think the abruptness that usually coincides with suicide makes it more complicated as you are kind of processing through what the loss means to your life moving forward.
When I've ran grief and loss groups, sometimes I'll ask people, like, what do you think is better, to lose someone suddenly or to lose someone when it's expected, it's coming? And it's interesting to get the different perspectives based on people's own experiences. And I always end it saying, one's not better or worse. They're just different. And they all add a different flavor to it. But
I'd want to know 100% of the time.
You'd want to know if a loss was coming?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Absolutely.
But don't you feel like that would be harder, like maybe like more prolonged?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's prolonged, but it's like you do a lot of processing as you approach it. But most importantly, I say that because it allows you the time you need to be intentional. Like I knew my dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, so I pulled up the journals and quickly realized that's a death sentence. 97% chance he'll die within the year. And so that allowed me to ask all the questions I wanted to ask, say all the things I wanted to say, and try to tidy up as much unfinished business as I could. Because one of the most difficult components of grief is the unfinished business that you no longer have an opportunity to finish. So
I think that is what makes suicide loss hard, is there wasn't time to prepare or say goodbye.
Yeah, so it's a lot of the general aspects of loss compounded with regret, guilt, the overwhelming feeling of knowing how much pain they had been in that for however long as, they were in it.
And whether I knew it or not.
Yeah,
did I see it?
Did I see it? Why didn't I see it? How couldn't I have seen it? I didn't do this. I didn't do that. I could have done this. I wish I would have done that. And it's just a lot more to torment yourself over. And it leaves a gaping mystery, flooded with ambiguity that, even in the cases of notes or letters or videos, there's still going to be a lot of blank spaces that you're not going to be able to fill in.
Do you think that like guilt and blame, or just kind of some of those emotions that you might take on yourself, is what also makes this complicated?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes, a lot of that's internalized through a filter of like personal responsibility. It's like when someone gets diagnosed with cancer, it's brutal, it's awful, it's horrible. It's like people die of cancer. It's like we know that.
And it's external to me.
And it's external to me, and it's external to the other person as well. It's like this is the card they were dealt. Whereas with suicide, it's just a totally different perspective when it comes to choice.
Yeah. I've been there personally. I lost a client a couple years ago, and we weren't 100% sure if it was suicide or if it was kind of a overdose, unplanned overdose. But yeah, that what if, could I have done something different? It's hard.
As a therapist who has lost a client to suicide, like first off, how did you find out? And then how did you cope afterwards? Because I'd imagine that this is something I see a lot of therapists talk about on like forums or groups or things, where they'll say, I just lost a client to suicide. Like, how on earth am I supposed to, still continue seeing clients this week? Or, how am I supposed to not blame myself, or, wonder if I should have done this or seen this or something as like a professional in their life. But how did you cope with that?
Consultation, supervision.
Yeah.
I mean, I just brought it to my consultation groups and to my supervisor and kind of walked through all the feelings, all the thoughts I was having.
Did you take any time off from clients, or did you jump straight?
No. And to be honest, I think the client, a good week or two had maybe passed even before I found out. And I had only found out because I reached out to another team member that I had to release to just say, hey, I haven't seen them in 2 weeks. Just wanted to check in. And they were the ones that notified me of what happened. So it was delayed.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel like, I mean, so you said you talked through things with a supervisor, with colleagues. I guess I'm just curious too, like, how did you process that loss more? I mean, was it really just helpful to talk through things with people, or did you?
I went back and read my notes as well, right? Just to see if, did I miss anything? Was there any hints, right? I think I just sat in it for a while.
Do you think that, go ahead, Erin.
No, I was just going to say, I'm glad to hear that you're bringing up the word consultation, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think it's necessary that we go and seek support from other therapists that have maybe experienced this and or have some understanding. And I think our role as a therapist, right? If you are overseeing a client that is going through any mental health crisis, right? There is that necessary reflection point of what therapists really have control over. Nothing. Mm-hmm. This individual is really going through this and we're walking that path with them, but we don't have control over the decisions that they make outside of our doors. And so, or even inside our doors, really, right? But I think it's making sure that you can process through that with other individuals that know you and know how you practice, and can support you through that.
Yeah, and because we don't have control over the choices our clients make, we have to remember that so we don't take on responsibility for the choices that our clients make. And from a therapist perspective, when a client dies by suicide, it's, there are the professional aspects of it, and there's absolutely going to be that filter. But at the same time, it's like, it's just grief. It's like, we know these people. Mm-hmm. It's like clients, there's a boundary as far as how much clients come to know about us as the therapist. But the inverse of that, there's no boundary. Mm-hmm. It's like, we know these people deeply. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of times we work with them for extended periods of time. It's like they become a part of our everyday consciousness. And, the loss there is, it's a loss. It's the loss of someone you cared about, regardless of the fact that it was within a professional clinical context.
And maybe even more complicated in that context too, because you likely can't really go to the memorial service. You can't really talk about this person to people outside of your, outside of your clinic or outside of your supervision. Yeah. And so it is just kind of this, I would imagine, it's just maybe a more lonely way to grieve too, and isolating.
Yeah, a lot of isolation in that. That's why it's so critical to have colleagues. Mm-hmm. It's like no one gets through this profession totally by themselves, or the ones who fool themselves into thinking they are or they can. It's like they're probably making mistakes, they're slipping, so in this circumstance, it's like it's your professional community or nothing.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think utilizing either just a colleague that you are close with to kind of help you not feel so isolated. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is kind of just how I practice in general, but making sure that grief is communal, right? Like there's so many rituals that are communal. There are so many, traditions that are built in to help us grieve and to call that out. And so when you are a therapist and having to hold that all for yourself, utilizing and understanding the relationships around you to make sure that that can be your community as you're going through and processing what that loss really means to you personally and professionally.
Yeah.
And what will really complicate that is if you were working with the client as part of a family system.
What do you mean?
So like if somebody dies by suicide, that's part of a family that you've been doing family therapy with. Because they're going to keep coming.
And well, they
they're
should.
going to need you.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's playing that bilateral role of supporting their grief while you're personally grieving yourself.
Yes.
And how do you use that effectively? You know, and what do you have to watch out for? Yeah.
I know that we're talking so much about kind of about the grief around this, but like pulling back and looking at this from like a professional lens, are there liability issues? Like could you get in trouble if a client dies by suicide?
There's a good chance you're going to get audited, or the file.
It's a critical incident.
Yeah.
You're supposed to report it.
Yeah.
Especially if there's like not if there are any third parties that get involved with it in any capacity. Your case notes and records are open source to any regulatory boards or authorities that need to review it.
Yeah.
What do you mean by you have to report it? Like you said, who would you report that to?
The
How
do you pronounce it? Ombudsman.
Yeah.
Is that a state specific thing, do you think? Or is that like nationally?
A great question.
I don't know.
I don't know. I know it's a Minnesota thing.
Well, I think that there's this, I mean, there's a lot of stigma around talking about suicide and just in general, but it's for a new therapist talking about suicide with their clients or talking about suicidal ideation can be nerve-wracking too, because you don't want to say or do the wrong thing. And then I think there's also this added layer of like, could I get in trouble if something happens? And I don't know, like, I think that I'm just curious, like,
I think some of it's maybe just for general tracking purposes, right? Like you would report it even if your client died by other means, not just suicide, right?
I see.
Some of it's tracking, unless like this punitive, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
But obviously that could come up too if they found that you were extremely negligent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, ultimately what they're doing is ruling out negligence. You know, it's not like they're trying to get you.
No.
Or like formally, like it's not a criminal investigation, but it's like so long as you've been covering your bases, there's absolutely not an expectation that if you're a therapist, you know, no one you ever see should ever die by suicide.
And when you say covering your bases, what would you put in
Documentation. That
So
the
like
case
safety
files,
plan.
Yeah, that the case file is solid. And, you know, you have everything in there that would get called for a review. Yeah.
Okay, switching back gears to grief. I was just, as we were talking about this, I was like, man, these are some interesting things that I have always, I feel like this is not something graduate school really prepared me well for either, where it's like talking about some of this stuff.
They're more lived experiences that once you go through then you learn from it.
You got to grow up, you got to mature, you know, and this is, I think for any therapist too, you know, it's like we have to come to terms with mortality, our mortality, and the mortality of everybody else, you know, which is, I lived in existentialism for a long time, and it kind of shows up a lot in meditations. And for those reasons, more than anything, that's why I would always want to know 100% of the time if I was going to lose someone I cared about. You know, but the other aspect of it too is, you know, to take some time to seriously come face to face with just how painful this life can be, how painful existence can be, you know, and that it can be a brand of pain that's so pervasive and powerful that people find themselves, you know, in a position where they decide that they just can't do it anymore.
For me, it's always that the person feels that they can't live life this way.
Yeah.
It's always this multitude of factors.
Well, yeah, it's like the suffering that I've been stuck in for however long, that becomes all of their foresight as they look ahead into the future. And there's no longer a sense of even being able to imagine what life would feel like outside of what I've been carrying with me and holding, you know, and I would agree. It's always a sentiment of, I can no longer tolerate living in this manner. But, you know, oftentimes in someone's mind, it's not articulated like that because how they've been living is the only way they could ever experience living again, at least in their mind.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we have had a different episode where we talked with Brittany Misquick and we talked about like how to talk about suicide with clients. Let's dive a little bit deeper into what you were just talking about, Lucas, though. if you're working with the family system, or if you're working with someone who is experiencing a suicide loss, or if you yourself is experiencing a suicide loss, how would you help someone walk through that grieving process, in like the aftermath of this?
If it was a member of a family that you've been seeing?
Yeah, like let's say you're seeing a client who, lost a loved one to suicide. Yeah. What does that treatment look like?
Slow.
Agreed. It is really slow, because I think there's a lot of that initial, if it's within a certain time frame, you really look at how is this individual really functioning in the moment? How are they presenting, right? And how can we get them, through the depths of that fog. I know I've referred to that before, of, like they almost feel like they're in a place of like, this is not real.
Yeah.
It's not happening. And so it all kind of, I think maybe advice for therapists walking into a brand new client that is coming in after a loved one has died. It's about meeting them where they're at and in that individual's functioning to say, okay, where are you at and what are you feeling in the moment? People are, of course, going to bring up those phases and stages of death and grieving. And I think it really is the perspective that I have of this loss has meant so much to you, and you have an attachment to this individual that has just died. How is that going to impact you in all factors of your life now, currently, presently, and in the future? Because we also, I think, tend to forget that 5 years, 10 years down the road, that pain is going to be reignited when there's other life events happening in the individual that has survived.
Can I force you to get up onto your soapbox quickly and just share a little bit about like the stages of grief? because I do think that that's a big myth around grieving and the grieving process that I think it can be repeated. I don't know how much we've even talked about that on this podcast.
It's not linear. I think that's the myth, is that you move through the phases, 1 through 5.
You're angry first.
Yeah, it doesn't happen like that. It can,
Yes.
but you'll cycle through it. Maybe the first time it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many phases are there? 7, 8.
Depending on who you
5.
talk to.
I think it's 5.
If you're looking at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's research, initially it was the 5 stages of death and dying, and her research was really applied to people that were given a terminal illness. What are the stages you go through? And acceptance of your terminal illness was the 5th stage.
Yeah.
But then they started applying that research to the grief and loss experience. And I think maybe that's, Erin, where we probably agree on this, that we just don't feel like that fits, right? Because again, it's not linear. We're constantly cycling through. So I actually prefer like the tasks of grieving. I think it's Warden.
Ooh, say more.
He's just a researcher that, again, kind of debunks Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's research and says, I more view it as like some different tasks that people have to go through.
Almost like developmental tasks or something.
Yeah, like one I think is finding meaning. I can't remember what they all are at the top of my head, but and I know I really value that one, right? To find meaning in the loss.
It's essential. It's also super complicated and tricky.
Yeah. It's long, and the process to get to that point is long. And so I think even this goes to show how many different therapists kind of have their own theoretical practice and how they, support an individual that is coming in. And there's not one right way. There's not one wrong way.
Well, I'd say there are some wrong ways. Like if a client's got super fresh, raw grief and they come in, it's like, don't start talking about meaning and finding meaning in it.
Right. Too soon.
Way too soon.
Where would you start?
Psychological education, validating.
Or just like, let your space become their dumpster of emotion. Just let them know that you can come here and you can get as sloppy as you need to get. You can be as grumbly as you need to be. It's like, you don't need to perform for me. You don't need to hold back anything that they generally are in all of their other interactions. It's like, let that out. It's like, you want to be mean to me? Be mean to me. That's fine. It's probably better for you to do it here than let it spill out there. And just let them know that that's what this space gets to be for them for now. Like, don't be eager. Don't be eager for your client to feel better.
And you don't have to have it all put together, right? Like, we can mumble and fumble through it and you just show up as you are.
I think what's hard about this topic too, specifically like this topic, is I could be a therapist that does not specialize in grief, does not specialize in anything related to this. And I could have a client walk through the door tomorrow and be like, this just happened and I need to talk with you about this. I'm not going to immediately refer her to see someone else. Likely, I mean, unless it's like way out of my depth, you're going to want to be able to continue the relationship that you're having and be able to sit with your client in this. And so I like what you were saying about, well, first off, yes, sitting with your client, trying to allow them space to process and just dump whatever's they're holding in your therapy space. But then you were also mentioning psychoeducation as kind of the next step. What would that look like?
So some of it's education on the grieving process, right? So just like I was saying about the 5 stages of death and dying or grief and loss. Sometimes I'll even go into that spiel and tell people about what I know about the process.
Well, and I think that's good too, because it's normalizing, like, you're going to go back and forth. You're going to be feeling all over the place, and there's not like, it's not linear. And
it's more like a spiral staircase, I think, that sometimes we revisit those things with more perspective. But some of the other psychoeducation is about just the symptoms and the variety of symptoms that people go through in different domains, right? Here are some physical symptoms you might have. Here are some social symptoms you might have, emotional, and normalizing all of them. I have a handout that sometimes I give my clients, and I'm like, okay, which ones of these are you having? Which ones of these? And sometimes we'll revisit that 6 months or a year later and just see where they are at.
What are some symptoms that are on the handout that you're talking about?
I mean, changes in appetite, changes in sleep, just emotional regulation, whether or not you want to go to church or not anymore. Or, I mean, there's quite a few.
So then you're normalizing, you're giving some education around this. Do you talk about kind of those tasks of grief at that point too?
No, I'm probably not bringing that up with the client, but I'm just kind of
keeping that in the back of your mind.
In my mind.
Okay, that makes sense.
I think when I'm practicing, if someone's coming in, it's about helping them understand even how I practice as well and how I view the grief process.
Kind of like what my role is.
And how I can help them go through their own process and what that is looking like, and kind of deciphering what this all means to them and how to apply it in their lives. Like, there's some commonalities, like Jennifer is saying, around these are some of the physical symptoms. These are some of the things that maybe you're going to be hesitant on doing. Changing routine even sometimes can be a symptom that people experience, right? Because that routine intertwined that individual that is no longer present. And so it's painful to do it that way. And so looking at your life to really kind of decipher, what are the things that I want to continue to do? Do I have the energy and the functionality to even do those right now? As simple as appetite. Okay, well, I used to cook with my loved one all the time. I don't even want to cook because that's too painful of an act to do, because it brings up all of this pain. And so, like, reflecting with each individual as they're coming in to know that they're all going to be at different places, and looking at those tasks as they may actually want to shift those and do them differently, and that's okay.
Like in a different order? Or what do you mean by doing the tasks differently?
Some people totally eliminate it. I don't want it. I'm not going to eat. I'm not going to do that, right? Or I'm going to go sleep on the couch from now on. It was interesting. I had a neighborhood individual open up to me the other day and tell me that his wife passed away 8 years ago. He still hasn't fixed and finished his bathroom remodel that he started after the cancer diagnosis. And I was like, okay, like that is grief. That is loss, right? And he looked at it as more of like a shameful act of like sharing this with me. But that's the impact of losing someone that you have so much love for.
What did you say to him?
You know what? I validated. I tend to be very, I don't give advice because it goes into all of the, people know I'm a therapist, so they're looking for that.
That's why I asked you. I was curious.
So I tend to just, validate and say, maybe someday you'll get to doing that when you're ready. And then I kind of divert and go off to a different conversation because he can have that with his own therapist that maybe he has or hasn't.
I'm kind of the opposite. I never give clients advice, but like I'm always dying to give citizens advice when they ask, which is almost never because I'm a therapist. So
because they don't want to know what you're going to say.
Yeah. They don't want to open that jar. But I think that says a lot about you, Opoku, that he was willing to disclose that to you as a neighbor and that it had been 8 years.
Yeah. It was, I think a lot of us therapists probably have therapists written in invisible ink above our head, and as soon as people find out that it's kind of like, oh, you're a safe place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's part of your job and you're a human.
Or are you psychoanalyzing me right now?
Yeah, you get that one all the time too.
So there's like a paralysis to this too, it's like that guy's paralyzed in his desire or will to finish that project.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and maybe it's, fear of what that would symbolize. It's like this bathroom's finally done and she's really gone.
Mm-hmm. I can't enjoy it without her. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that's
or what's
so
the point?
sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's the point?
It's hard stuff.
You guys,
please.
Oh, I would say, have you heard of the story or the song Going on a Bear Hunt?
Yeah.
I always use that song as a way to reference grief work.
Wait a second. Erin just looked at me like, what?
You have kids?
I'm from Chicago.
Going on a bear hunt.
Gonna catch a big one. What a beautiful day. We're not scared. What?
Gotta have a dance party.
I shelter my children, I guess.
Oh no, grass, tall, wavy grass. Can't go over.
All right, if it hasn't clicked yet.
But anyways, in the story or in the song, the children who are going on the bear hunt come across different obstacles, right? Grass or a pond. And we always say, you can't go over it, can't go under it, you got to go through it, right? So I always let my clients know we're going to go through it together and I'll walk with you.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
And that's the only way out is through. And like, it's not going to be pleasant, but that's okay because imagine how you'd have to reimagine your entire relationship that you had with that person to find yourself in a position where grieving them was pleasant. It's like we don't get to love people as deeply as we come to love people without knowing that it comes with the potential risk of losing them and having to figure out how to live without them. And so it's like, that's meaning. I think that's what, when they talk about meaning, I think it largely, it comes down to that and just the duality of so much in life.
How do you think the working through the grief process with a client, how do you think that looks different with an abrupt loss, like a suicide, versus like maybe a more prolonged process?
I guess I would say if we know it's planned, we can talk about, okay, what do you want to do? How do you want to say goodbye? Are there some tasks that you want to engage in, right? Do you want to ask them to write down family recipes or things like that, right? Like there's things you can do to prepare. when it's that sudden and unexpected, right, we're more talking about it in reverse. What do you wish you had said if you could go back in time?
Because there are a lot of ways you can still at least give yourself the experience of saying it. I think open chair work is always powerful when people are stuck in grief.
I do something similar to the open chair technique where we're writing down a dialogue.
Yeah.
And it's like you're writing both your words and your loved one's words.
I like that. Can you say more about open chair work?
Yeah, open chair work is like, the textbook kind of briefly talks about it as if it's like a relic that lives on the museum of therapy's history. But this comes out of Gestalt therapy, and I think it's one of the most powerful interventions I tend to use regularly. And it's, we talk to people in our heads all the time. We internalize a lot. We'll talk about somebody, that's not in the room within the context that they're not in the room. Open chair work is, identifying a space in the office for them to turn toward and look at and to say what they want to say to that person as if they were in that chair. And it's weird to introduce, it's like the first time you suggest it, it's like the client needs to trust you because you need to let them know that it's like, I'm going to ask you to do something kind of weird, or bizarre or something you've probably never done before. It might be uncomfortable.
Feels vulnerable.
Oh, it's super vulnerable. But every single time, it's like once they get over that initial hump, like the first time they start talking in like you, as opposed to like they or them, like then they just lock into it and they just go and go and go. And so much comes out. And that's what makes it so powerful. Like they really enter into the moment as if that person was here.
It kind of reminds me of like the conversations we've had around like exposure therapy or even virtual reality therapy, where you can trick your brain into thinking that you are, experiencing this moment, experiencing these emotions and kind of processing through it. And so I always am so fascinated, and I like open chair work for that reason, because I think it's powerful because it might sound crazy. Hey, let's just imagine your dad is sitting on that chair. What would you say to him right now? I mean, it is vulnerable. It can be uncomfortable. It might seem odd, but it really does work because I think your brain is able to kind of get in that moment, especially when you use the pronoun or like when you used the word you.
You have to. If they can't get to that point, they're not doing it. I think that's a big differentiator where if I'm looking at you, my therapist, and saying, well, I would say that, I'm still focused on our conversation. But if I'm focused on the chair and I'm saying, you said these things, I feel this way, it is that much more powerful. And I can see how that can be helpful in an abrupt loss like this. Yeah. When you have unfinished business with someone who's passed away, it's like, it's your second best option to being able to have the conversation you didn't get to have while they were alive. And, it's like, if I can't have the best car, then I would like the second best car, and so it's like, why not at least give ourselves that?
I would imagine that writing it down in a dialogue would be even more, it would be harder or even more emotional though too, because you're taking the time to write it. I don't know. For me, writing is always just so much more emotional because it's a little bit more drawn out.
I think there's a lot of different ways that therapists are probably utilizing that technique that you're talking about and don't realize that that's probably where it started. I think I'm thinking of a client that I had worked with for a long time, and we were kind of circling some of the emotional heavy stuff and the conversations that they were never able to have. And we actually, they shared with me one day that the voicemail of the individual that had died was still active. And I actually had them call and leave voicemails for that conversation so they could hear the loved one's voice to help get them into, right? It's not open chair.
Same concept, yeah.
But it's the same concept. And that's to be able to have those unfinished conversations that I think a lot of people that have survived suicide, like those are the conversations that they probably are like holding on to or longing to actually have. And I think it's really powerful to be able to have your client kind of go through those conversations depending on how your client is, right? Like if they are verbal, or if, like you were saying, Miranda, if writing is really powerful to them, utilizing that strength of theirs to be able to provoke some of that movement through that pain.
How do you support a client, a grieving client that is holding a lot of anger and is like really angry towards the person that they lost?
I call it out. I normalize it. Specifically we're talking about, loss by suicide and completion of suicide. And that feeling of anger, I think, is present in lots of different loss. But I think from my experience clinically, I think it may be more, there's more stigma behind it, probably because, suicide is stigma all over the place.
Like the client might be feeling, I can't be angry at them. Or what do you mean by?
Possibly. Yeah. And so I usually call that generalization of anger out pretty quickly.
What would you say?
I usually utilize my iceberg, metaphorical iceberg around, this is anger and it's maybe coming out sideways, but these are all the feelings underneath it. And people can relate to the other identified feelings, but then kind of make that click of going, oh, it is really that I'm pissed off, I'm angry. But it feels less harsh if we can identify all the other things that are.
It's like anger is always a secondary emotion, if not a tertiary emotion. And as clinicians, we have to. It's like when anger comes up with my clients, it's like I just see anger as it just shifts me to a state of like, all right, what's beneath that? And like even when you work on anger management with people, or like when people want to address anger management, maybe 10% of the time we'll be talking about anger. It's like you just get to what's beneath it and help them get in touch with what's actually going on and find the language for it. And once they could find the language with more of a primary emotion or experience and articulate that and externalize it, it's like they're actually externalizing something. Because when you tell yourself that you're just angry and you just act out all of that anger, you're not releasing what you're actually holding inside of you.
I think it's a jump for a lot of clients, because a lot of time it's actually the loss of love that is presenting as anger, right? And for them to identify that I'm feeling so angry because of the intense love that I felt for this individual, it's a hard jump for clients, but once they make that correlation, there's usually some movement forward, is from what my experience is.
It's such a heavy topic. There's just so much to it. Other kind of thoughts or things that you see come up for people who are walking through the grieving process in ways that we can be supporting them?
I think I just go back to therapy can be a safe place to talk about all the emotions, right? Even just going back to the anger. When people do other tasks of grieving, right? Maybe have a funeral or a service. Most people aren't getting up there in their eulogy and talking about why they're angry at their loved one, right? And so therapy can be a safe place to just explore and name all those.
Yeah. I think realizing that there's a community out there actually that may have gone through something similar. I know there's lots of resources out there, but specifically within, I know it's across the country. I don't know the specifics of which states they're in, but Minnesota specifically has an empty chair dinner organization that...
What?
Yeah.
What is that?
It is an organization, I want to say it's called Empty Chair, and I might have to figure out that
Google.
resource for you for sure. But what they really do is it's individuals, family members, or loved ones that have had an individual, a death by suicide, that they actually all gather for dinner. And they also have the names of the individuals that have died included into the dinner service. And so it's a community that they've started to really help process through. And it's someone that you know that they may be experiencing something similar. So it has really just kind of built a community. And I think it's held like monthly dinners, you know, because food, tradition, like all of those things can help people move through that pain.
I would say on a national level, I refer people to SAVE or AFSP. Both of those organizations offer kind of specific grief and loss groups for suicide bereavement.
I'll add these links in the description. That's really helpful. I think anytime we can have more resources and things, it's great.
Yeah, I think when it's a client, you know, it's like you just keep showing up for them as you have been. When it's someone in your personal life, you know, I like to mention or acknowledge just something along the lines of, like, I just, like, you're not trying to do this alone, are you? And like, it doesn't need to be me, you know? But I just hope that there's somebody, because nobody gets through this stuff alone. We're not built or wired to get through this stuff alone. You know, as far as suicide prevention goes, or if we're worried about somebody, it's like, we should worry about everybody, you know, because again, it's like life is incredibly difficult. And people say often, like, you never know what someone's dealing with. You never know what someone's struggling with. And it's become one of those things it's like we become so desensitized to it, it's almost lost meaning. But it's like, seriously examine that to its depth, and like realize that every single human you ever encounter, it's like the one thing that you know with certainty that you have in common with them is that you've both experienced suffering, and you both will continue to experience suffering. And if that's at the forefront of your interactions with humans, it'll transform a lot in your life, and it'll start to transform a lot in other people's lives too.
Beautiful.
Any other last thoughts?
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for talking through this incredibly difficult topic, but super important for us to keep talking about this and to be sharing information and resources and just how to best help someone walk through this. But thank you guys so much for joining, and thanks for listening.